Hey everyone, it's Chad,
Hi, it's Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. So, well, first to point out, we like to say it has been a little time, if you haven't noticed, since our last kind of release of the series. Just wanted to pick it up again and just keep this series going and start to finish it out with this last episode in a way that we wanted to when we were last recording it, but we felt like we wanted to improve upon it a little bit. So, in the last episode of our series of Peace v. Freedom, we focused on the two presidents, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And we looked at them in regards to some speeches that they had in regards to the Persian Gulf War of 1991 and then the Iraq War of 2003. Um, in in brief, the main point that we talked about was them having a very offensive view of liberalism. One that saw liberalism as one that couldn't just be sitting on the sidelines and letting dictatorships oppress the freedoms of those across the world, in this case, the Middle East. This was a liberalism and a freedom that just could not let atrocities continue. And if we were to be a country that would say to uphold these values of, say, free press or freedom of religion or freedom of economic decisions or anything of that sort, we have to uphold those values not just to ourselves, but for those all across the world. And so with that, that's kind of how we ended out that last episode. With this one, we're going to be looking at a very, very current example of Zelensky in regards to the war in Ukraine. Um, we're going to bring up some of his speeches. We're going to bring up the United Nations. And in general, we're going to try to start to head our way towards our next main series, The Modern Empire.
All right. So when we're talking about Zelensky and we're talking about his current leadership in Ukraine, we got to move a little earlier into the conflict back when it might have looked like Ukraine would lose. You know, as we were talking about I believe in it was Reformed Don't Revolt, or maybe A More Perfect Union, either one. But it was centered the um around around the heroic effort that was the defense of the country in those first few weeks. So from there, we'd like to mention one of Zelensky's speeches that he made to the UN General Assembly, I believe it was, or maybe the Security Council, but the speech to the UN on its ineffectiveness. He was basically calling it out, you know, wondering why it even existed because of the inability of it to condemn Russia's actions and step in. You know, when the UN might have acted in, let's say, Iraq in 1991, it wasn't acting here because of Russia's position on the Security Council, which Zelensky viewed, and I'd say, you know, I think Chad would say as well, is a fatal flaw of the system. So he starts off quoting, "So where is the security that the Security Council must guarantee? There is no security, although there is a Security Council, as if nothing happened. So where is the peace that the United Nations was created to guarantee?" End quote. So he's highlighting the fact that the point of the United Nations was to resolve conflict, to prevent conflict as well. But like if a conflict were to break out, to resolve conflict, to end it, to prevent aggressive action and to punish it, really. But because of the structural problems of the Security Council, which has its own very interesting history, um, it made it so that any founding member of the UN was a permanent member of the Security Council, which acts as a sort of ruling body of the UN. Like nothing happens basically unless it's like really nothing happens in the UN without the support of the Security Council. And it's made up of 15 countries, but only five are permanent. The other 10 rotate every few years. And one of those permanent members is Russia. And one of the powers that these permanent members have is to be able to veto any action by the General Assembly. And what happened in the General Assembly was that they voted to condemn Russia, and Russia vetoed it. And
Hmm.
so there was no action. And and so Zelensky, being the leader of a country that is very proud and very focused on defending itself, is calling out the hypocrisy of the very title Security Council. And so then again, later on in the speech, he says, quote, "It is obvious that the key institution of the world, which must ensure the coercion of any aggressors to peace, simply cannot work effectively." And so it's a serious question that he's asking. The international force that was meant for peacekeeping, drawn up by FDR, Winston Churchill, and Stalin too, but people that were very focused on creating international peace at a very violent time in world history.
Hmm.
Um, the institution they helped create was not working. It's not working
Yeah,
anymore. Maybe even if there was a time that it was working, it's not working anymore. People, like nations, are using their veto in unnecessary ways to undermine the system.
exactly. An anti-democratic dictator, Vladimir Putin, is essentially swaying the decisions that hundreds of millions or even billions of people are making in the United Nations. With their one veto, they could basically take down a motion again by the entire world against one or two, maybe whatever allies that they might get along with them, say like North Korea and Iran. Vladimir Putin could make a decision to veto the decisions and the will of billions of people. It's inherently hypocritical to international order as itself. The United Nations was created for the world to get together and countries to make, to figure out decisions, to stop wars, to punish those who are punishing others, all that sorts of things. And then we have the ability through the Security Council of one nation to go against the desires of the entire world, to go against the desires of hundreds of countries because they have the singular power of a veto. With the Security Council, because of that um, unanimous lack of veto, essentially, they have the ability to do this. And it just points out one of the biggest flaws that a system which was made to create an entire international order had. I mean, one of the flaws that it has, and this is what Zelensky wanted to point it out. The UN can't even do this. They can't even enforce once again, essentially unanimous decision. What is the point of it?
Right. So another thing that is worth pointing out is that like these countries, they're not small countries. They're not countries with small GDPs, with with like a lot of cooperation with other countries is required to keep it afloat. Like they're not like small or weak. They're not nations you would have never heard of. Like these are nations that have huge economies. These are nations that have huge militaries. These are nations that have high populations. These are nations that have tons of territory, like Russia, China, the US, UK, France. Now, UK and France, out of all three of those in terms of population and size, especially, they're kind of on the lower end. But when it comes um to the fact that these are very powerful nations, that is one thing to point out because what makes a nation a permanent member of the Security Council means that a it was part of the Allied alliance as of January 1942. And so they were one of the major powers that was fighting the Nazis or fighting the Italians or fighting the Japanese during World War II. Now, many nations joined on to fight and to defeat these nations later on, but to be able to stick on from that early of a time when it seemed like all those enemies of security and peace, um, that early on in the war meant that you had to be very powerful, you know, and you had to be um and you just had to be very powerful. And so you look at Russia and China and the US today, they are very big nations. And so these are the nations that are now having such a huge role in international like decision making, that it kind of is the dynamic of bigger nations are more important than smaller nations, even though that's exactly against what the UN Charter was meant to bring forth. And
Exactly.
so, yeah, and then you have the example of Russia being part of the Security Council and not, the other nations as part of the USSR, something that I bet Chad also wants to mention. Because what's interesting is the unfair nature in which nations that were called on to be part of the Security Council um, were decided. Because as I mentioned, just a couple minutes ago, that you needed to be a combatant in World War II against the Axis alliance by January 1942. Technically, like if the UK was part of that, you're talking about the entire British Empire. So you can include India, but of course they wouldn't. But with Russia, you can make that same argument as well. You know, like you're choosing nations that might have more political clout or might be bigger in size, you know, and they get these positions of power in the Security Council, even when they don't exist in their current form anymore. So yeah, Chad, why don't you expand on that?
Oh yeah, it's arbitrary by nature to require that only the people who are permanent on the Security Council are the ones who fought in World War II. As you said, why is it that only Russia out of the 15, 16 countries of the USSR was the one that would be continued to pick to have their permanent seat on the Security Council? If the goal of the United Nations is to have democratic rule over international order and international law, why are we simply enabling the most powerful countries again to be making the rules and systems that every other little country has to follow by? This was the main thing that we were trying to solve with the United Nations. If we went back into the European history, the biggest countries with the biggest empires and the largest boats and the biggest navies, aircraft carriers, whatever, came later. But the biggest countries were the ones who made the rules. And with the Security Council giving those most powerful nations who in history were the most powerful and albeit still are the most powerful, with the United States, China, Russia, being debatable, with it still continuing to this day, it just continues to be antithetical to the mission of the United Nations. Um, with the Security Council, with that otherwise, I mean, besides those five permanent seats, we have the 10 ones that get cycled around every now and then. But given the fact that they don't have that permanent all encompassing essentially veto, there's not really much of a point being on there because unless they still get the entire Security Council to agree on a certain point, say condemn Russia or to allow a certain country to follow through with some trade route, unless they could do that, those smaller countries being on the Security Council doesn't have much of a purpose if it's still the larger countries like the US and China could just say no. It just doesn't, it again, it does not work with the whole idea of international law and order. If we want it to be a democratic system in which multiple countries are empowered to exercise their power across the world, or say build coalitions with other countries and have their prevailing ideology be the one that other countries agree upon, having the ability of one or two countries to simply veto all of that, just as Russia did in the early stages of the Ukraine war, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
And so this creates a very toxic international environment, and that's one thing that Biden wanted to point out in his address during the UN General Assembly meeting in late September of this year. Um, he um, he he basically, well, first, just to quote the excerpt, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council invaded its neighbor, attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map. Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter, no more important than the clear prohibition against countries taking the territory of their neighbor by force, end quote. And so he said this, marking out the the precedent that this has on international stability. That a nation, since they make the rules, they can break the rules. And therefore, um, like force has been brought into international disputes, something that the UN was meant to solve, that it was meant to be through dialogue, that a nation give up some territory because, let's say, the people there wanted to be part of another country. That's why you have referendums. Those things exist. Those things are real. Nations do shrink in size and grow in size based off of legitimate political dispute and in decision making and dialogue. Um, but force was something that the UN was designed to prevent. And Biden is basically saying that it's perpetuating it. And that's something that I would largely agree with. What was interesting here is that we might be inclined to think that he's being ingenuine, that he's not being, for real. But what he said right after this, and I don't have the quote um like on me right now, but he said that there should be an expansion of the Security Council. So nations from other regions of the world that may have different points of view should be added as part of the Security Council and permanent status as well, I believe he also said. And so that kind of, although maybe not completely, it does add a bit of legitimacy to his point about his complaint to Russia. Because if Biden was going to complain here about Putin's actions or Xi's actions in Xinjiang, you know, then it might sound hypocritical because of all the terrible things that the US might have done. But if it's going to promote the expansion of the Security Council and therefore more nations being able to have a hand in the real decision making of the world, then that kind of changes the equation. It changes things.
Exactly. It brings the United Nations, it's one idea that brings the United Nations back to one of the core purposes of having nations be involved in how international order is established and enforced. If it's just the most powerful countries again making the rules, then how different are we from the 18, 17, 1600 empires battling for whoever had the most navy or the most influence or the most grain? This is one of the ideas that he brought up as a way that the system could be reformed. But again, his speech brought forward a very important point that as it stands now, the United Nations, through its empowering of these older, more powerful countries having undue, I'd say, undue influence over world decisions, how it is now is a system that is kind of perpetuating violence. And this was something that Zelensky would continue to echo in his April 2022 speech to the United Nations, saying, quote, "We are dealing with a state that turns the right of veto in the UN Security Council into a right to kill, which undermines the whole architecture of global security, which allows evil to go unpunished and spread the world, destroying everything that can work for peace and security," unquote. And it kind of continues that because it goes along with this point. Quote, "Are you ready for the dissolving of the United Nations? Do you think that the time of international law has passed?" End quote. This is again what he was referencing this before. But as the system is now, as the United Nations is now, the power that the people on the Security Council have, such as Russia, had the power that they have, right to veto is a right to kill. It's a right to invade an entire nation and basically stop the entire world from doing anything about you. I mean, it seems like a joke that he's kind of saying this. I mean, Zelensky was a comedian, but it's true. I mean, do we want, if this system is all it's going to be doing is just reinforcing the most powerful nations to do whatever they want, why we have it? Are we just ready to just get rid of it? Because we might as well. We're not even doing anything about it. We're just letting it rot. We're letting countries take advantage of the system that we have and not doing anything to fix it. Are we ready to get rid of the UN? He asked this question, and it sounds, I mean, it's rhetorical because it's a call to action to fix it, but it's a legitimate question. If we're going to leave the system as it is and let people take advantage of it, what's the point of even having it?
Right. And that's why okay. And that's why you hear it from the leader of a country that isn't necessarily too influential. When like most people around the world, whether they be in the Middle East, in Far East Asia, or anywhere in Africa or here in America or Europe, you know, they would think of Ukraine as being tied to Russia in a way. You know, culturally, politically, economically, whatever, that that Ukraine can only be thought of as a country through its relation or through its opposition maybe to Russia. It's not a particularly powerful country. It doesn't have a particularly huge economy. Its military before aggression by Russia has been it wasn't particularly strong. It wasn't super big, um, but it's still like you hear it from a nation with a relative um what's the word I'm looking for? Unbiased point of view. Because while of course in this particular issue he's going to be biased in the sense that he's going to be against Russia and Putin for what they're doing. When he speaks for the reformation of the international system, he's not speaking for America. He's not speaking for Europe. He's not speaking for Russia, of course. He's not speaking for India or China. He's speaking for his country, a relatively small and poor country, a relatively unpowerful and small country even to the other big countries I just mentioned, and regions. So moving on to the next quote. The power of the UN Charter must be restored immediately. The UN system must be reformed immediately so that the right of veto is not a right to kill. End quote. Because him, as the leader of Ukraine, as I already mentioned, a relatively poor, weaker, and small country, um, he wants his country to be safe. He wants his country to be free, like the leader, any good leader of any country around the world, big or small. There's a certain dignity of nations that the UN Charter mentions, and actions like these show that the UN Charter, a system which was agreed upon in 1945, is being thrown away now you know, that the right of veto that a nation has, that it can just disrupt entire global policy because its country helped in defeating enemies 80 years ago, has become the ability to break the rules that you yourself made.
and not
So,
have any accountability for them. As we mentioned before, the United Nations as it stands gives power to the people, say on the Security Council, to do whatever they want and to stop everyone from stopping them. A veto, a veto of a General Assembly bill, of 180 some 190 countries could be stopped by one vote and nothing will happen. By empowering these countries to do this and violate the own charter that they're supposedly up to be upholding, what's the point of even having the system as it currently is? We go back to his quote where he says, "Are we ready to just dissolve the United Nations?" Um, to continue on with this point, I want to figure this out with one of his last quotes of his speech. And for context, he's referencing a video that he would show to, the whole council, of course, and also to Congress in a later speech. He said, quote, a video of what has come to replace your power because someone alone can abuse his rights, end quote. And so just this brings up again the big issue here in that a country on its own can go against the will of billions of people, given because of the power that the United Nations through the Security Council gives them, and no one could be checked. I mean, a guilty man will not convict himself if he's brought into trial. It's just how it is. No one wants to, incriminate themselves. It's not in their self-interest. And so it's foolish to hope that a country, say, like Russia, will simply realize its wrongdoings and say, this is not what we want to do. All these countries voted against us, and maybe I've changed my mind. It's foolish to do so. Or if not foolish, I'd say just a little naive. It's just not exactly how the world works, although we might hope it would. For in order to have any sort of accountability, these countries can, I mean, United Russia can't have the ability to use its right to veto, as Zelensky said it, as a right to kill. And with this whole speech, as we wrapped up this quotes that you'd have here, again, it's a criticism of the United Nations as it is. It gives, as I said before, kind of undue power to these established members of the Security Council, these established members of the United Nations, to uphold the rules when they want to, and when they violate them, use the rules to avoid the rules and the consequences of their own actions. And as long as the system stands, it just seems as hypocritical. It's set up as a way of democracy on an international scale, but it just ends up being an ineffective execution of it. If this is how we want international law to be, then why not just go back to the big countries bullying around all the smaller ones? Because that's how it is with how the Security Council is.
So like this is a point, it's very good, but it's hard to explain. So hang on. The the UN. Okay. So like this crisis is probably the closest that we will get to a world war post 1945,
Hopefully.
because like, and that's a big claim, but that's what I say, because it's like we live in a nuclear world, which is something that's worth mentioning. But it is, we're using like the West, whatever other parts of the world that aren't Russia, we're using so many different types of means of conflict to stop this aggression, economically, politically, whatever, you know, that we are influencing the events, in Russia and on the battlefield in Ukraine, um, as if we were in the war itself. And because of that, it has led to reverberations around the world economically. In Europe, they're suffering because of a lack of gas, and so it's very cold there. And then for a lot of other reasons, they can't drive around. They don't have like fuel or oil, for their food, whatever. And then in North Africa and much of the Middle East, they may not have as much food because Russia, because of the conflict, they want lifting of sanctions, and so, like, in response, they will withdraw their food exports and Ukraine's as well from the Black Sea. And so that means that nations, people in these nations and these parts of the world, they just want peace. They want peace at any cost. But, and that's why you might hear someone, from Germany, particularly. There's actually a German kid I know here who you're going to hear from later on, in one of our roundtable discussions. But you know, his opinion on this has gotten slightly less strong by being spending more time in America and speaking to Americans that are politically knowledgeable. But there is a strong opinion that 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 Russia's actions can be justified because of aggressive actions by the US, which they say leads NATO. Um, and their view of that comes from a certain understanding, um a certain, I'd say twisted, but understanding of self-defense. And from that, I'd like to quote again On Politics by Alan Ryan, page 178. Self-defense is always a legitimate ground for fighting, and nobody should hesitate to fight back when attacked. Self-defense is always a valid casus belli, nor need we wait until the enemy is literally at the gates before we resist. We may frustrate his preparations for attack as well. These claims became part of the standard account of just war doctrine in the later Middle Ages and are enshrined in modern doctrine, to the extent of featuring in the Charter of the United Nations. The less usual claim is that in a just war, a state punishes the crimes of another state and its people, end quote. So marking out the last sentence away from this, which is like something that is worth mentioning, but is not central to the point I'm making, is that the whole concept of self-defense, it is not as simple as someone invades your country and then you fight back. If a nation is literally assembling an army that and it's growing every day on your border that will have the capacity to wipe out your nation, it would be in your best interest to fight that before it eventually comes and attacks you first. And that's probably the opinion of Vladimir Putin as he sees the expansion of NATO on his borders. He's looking at it from a Murphy's Law perspective that if they can attack, they will. But that is very dangerous of a position to have because NATO, and you could look at it more specifically, there are probably people that are more knowledgeable on this than me, but NATO isn't necessarily setting up like a million man army on its borders with Russia. It's just enough to be able to defend itself. That's why they have the rapid response force deployed in Germany or Poland, wherever it was, that has now been moved to the Baltics because of aggression by Russia. They like NATO has the capacity to bring in 2 million soldiers or more, maybe even 6 to 10 million, if they were really trying to attack Russia, but they haven't because they're trying to do everything, to defend itself, you know. And so what's happened now that Russia has attacked Ukraine is that NATO, which is in its charter, in its own description, a defensive alliance, um, they have sent more troops to the borders of Russia because they're scared of a Russian attack. What is important to mention in the case of Russia and Ukraine is that Russia is the one that attacked, not NATO. As much as Putin wants to say that NATO's been gathering up on their borders and they were going to use Ukraine as a basis of which to attack Russia, NATO didn't attack anybody. And Putin may say that this is some sort of like very clever ploy to goad him into attacking. But no, it's not that complicated. It's not 5D or 8D chess right now. Now, what happened is that he misinterpreted self-defense, and the result of it is the undermining of the international structure.
Right. You pointed out in that quote, there was an interesting thing that I saw in there that I'd like to highlight as we move on to our next point. In mentioning what we talk about, how self-defense isn't limited to a literal self-defense where, quote, the enemy is literally at the gates, end quote. There is a way in which self-defense could be had before the fact, before the fighting even starts. As we had in the quote, it said, we may frustrate his preparations for attack as well, end quote. And this essentially is what the United Nations is here to do, if you want to look at it like that. The United Nations is to stop international conflict, wars, disputes. It's to stop nations from getting to the point of invading their neighbors for oil or for grain or for stopping them from joining a defensive alliance. The whole point of the United Nations is to stop that kind of conflict. It's the self-defense through law, through decision making, and through the input of various different nations across the world in a united member, hence the United Nations. But something that the war in Ukraine very, very visibly pointed out is just the ineffectiveness of this United Nations in upholding this idea of self-defense, a self-defense not through conflict in itself, but through diplomacy and through deal making and negotiating and condemning and making things happen. Is this war showed that the United Nations essentially was weak. It couldn't stop Russia from invading Ukraine. It couldn't stop um, it couldn't stop Russia for sending its thousands of troops across the border. After time and time again, it was evident that it was very obvious what was going to happen. The United Nations could not prevent this. The organization set to uphold international law failed. We all across the world, we hope for a system that wants to uphold a sense of order across, between countries, at the very least, to have some sort of peace between them. While we might dispute over what level of what type of government every country should have, or what type of system, or what type of economy, or what color flag they should have, that's all to our own little dealings. But at some aspect, we want some sense of peace all across, between the nations so that we could figure out our own problems for ourselves. Hence, this is something we talked about much, much earlier in our series, peace v freedom. But some aspect, we do want some international order. And this war, as I said, very evidently pointed out that the United Nations could not guarantee this order. And so we get to a point that we're wanting trying to point out is someone, something, or someone has to uphold the sense of international order. It might be a country, it might be a system, it might be an economy, but when we look at who is most equipped to handle this international order through say alliances or economies or ideologies, someone has to take the place of the United Nations in guaranteeing a sort of peace across the world. And I would think, and we were trying to make the point here, that out of necessity, the United States has had to do so. And I'll let you continue on with this one, Khalil.
Right. Because it sounds it admittedly it does sound like something an imperialist would say, you know,
Yeah.
but it's you have to look at it by step logical position, which I think is something that we have done up until this point and something that we hope to continue to do with our modern empire series. But like the UN, as we've already said, is weak. It has not been able to stop conflict. And so what force is going to be able to stop things from happening? A sort of like Reagan era peace through strength sort of deal, you know, like a force in the world that will bring peace through its strength, but then also preach freedom. Now, then again, the US will talk a lot about freedom, and there have been times when they had not went through with that promise. But at least the alternative is best. I mean, the alternative is like compared to the alternative, it's best. Because what other nations can even be um put into the same discussion in terms of its peacekeeping power? Like what, China, Russia? I mean, we
Right.
learned just recently that Russia's military is weak. So as far as like peace through strength, and through its strength, it's going to keep peace. It doesn't seem to have enough strength to be able to do anything, you know. But China, we have yet to see that, you know. So it's like their ability to be able to keep that peace, we that's hard to say. One of them definitely not. The other one we don't know. But like, are there systems like that keep the freedom of the world, that keep the dignity of human people, more than the other? Which one's the better out of the alternative?
Right.
I want to trust China, who has brought about a social credit system within the country. Are we going to trust China that is bringing about human rights abuses to millions of people in its western regions and getting away with it? Something that some people have even equated to a modern day Holocaust. But I digress. And then now with Russia, who is which is has brought its country into martial law. Putin, who has mobilized his people, who has brought his economy down to shit because of actions that he took that were unjust, trying to erase the culture of a people, trying to starve people in the Middle East and Northwest and Northeast Africa, because he doesn't want the sanctions on his country, that came as a result of his violent and aggressive action. Like the alternative is the US.
Right.
As
It's
much as like Americans and people that have suffered by the hands of the American government, like us African Americans, we can admit, looking at it hard enough and looking at it from a logical step-by-step position, that if the UN is weak and if the alternative is a powerful peacekeeping force that preaches freedom and better than the other ones actually keeps its promise, we have to say, I can't think of any alternative is the US, because
yeah,
it's not just about the intention. There may be nations around the world that have the intention of bringing about peace, maybe India, maybe Europe, you know, like but the US has mastered the art of peace through strength because it has the biggest, highest funded, most powerful, force multiplying military ever.
yeah, and of course to add on, economies and alliances too.
Of course.
Yeah. And so what we're arguing for here is not, a supremacy through it is right. We're saying that it's out of necessity. The United Nations, as it stands now, we're not saying that United Nations is always going to be weak. It's not always going to follow the same rules it has. There are many ways that the United Nations can be reformed, as we looked at, reforming the Security Council, opening up permanent status to other nations, getting rid of a unit of an all-encompassing veto, maybe even getting rid of the Security Council all in itself. Those are ways that the United Nations can be fixed. But as it stands now, that's just not how the United Nations is. And so as it is now, it is weak. And so a country that is most equipped as of now to take, to kind of bring about international order, not always through military force, because we don't always have to. It could be through political, through economic, through trade means. The country that is best equipped out of necessity to deal with this issue is the United States. And we're not saying because we are perfect, because, Khalil brought up, we're not. There's a reason that, even he and I are even in this country. And then that was out of a very terrible decision that our country made. Um, we we again, we are not perfect. We never will. We won't be. It's the mission of us to become perfect. But as of now, again, out of necessity, the United States is best equipped to take upon this idea of bringing about international order. Again, not always through military means, but say through economic or even ideological means.
Right. So, like, we just want to clarify that because we don't want anyone to think that we're Americans, and we might even add in a little bit of personal facts ourselves. We have never left the country. We are both Americans who have never left our country. So it might sound biased, but we have done our research. We are, I'd say very educated on this topic, and we wanted to be fair. We made admissions that maybe some more patriotic Americans would not have made, you know, even some Americans that I know myself. Um, but we have come to the conclusion, again, through a step-by-step logical position, if we're going to say that the UN is too weak to solve disputes, which it is, then what's going to take that place? Now, again, um, we have to admit that the US is not perfect. You know, it is um um it is a unipolar power, because of its strength. But there is need to admit that there is no check against this power. Like for example, like and I'm just gonna mention this, but very recently, a few days ago, last week, the UN General Assembly voted 189 to 2 to condemn the US's arms embargo or economic embargo on Cuba, which has existed for the past 60 years, I believe. And this is a vote that happens every year, and it's the 30th one in a row. So for 30 years, the UN has been trying to stop this. And this is not the only vote that has been so lopsided. And so nearly every nation in the world voted against the US on this time. We just had the support of Israel. Um, and because we voted and we have the right of veto, it didn't go through. And so again, something that is unethical, something that doesn't need to happen. The whole point of the arms embargo is to make the Cuban people desperate and lead a revolution in the country against socialist power. So it's unethical, but it couldn't be stopped. So as much as we're saying that the UN is weak, it's also weak against us. And so, as much as we might preach freedom and as much as we might follow through with it better than other countries, and as much as we have the power to keep the peace, in nations that might be aggressive against others, you know, we still have our own problems. But we're best equipped. If somebody is going to take international order's place, we're the best one to do it. And I'm open to suggestions. Speaking as an American, I'm open to suggestions. If I was Biden and I was speaking openly, going to the General Assembly, saying that the Security Council needs to be expanded, that nations in Africa or nations in Latin America need to be added as a permanent member of the Security Council is a good idea. It's a way of reforming the system, because you don't want to abolish the UN. That would be too far, but to reform it, to make serious changes, would be nice. And so, of course, that would be the right way to go forward. And Chad, why don't you go ahead?
Absolutely. So just you made a very good point in that this idea of a United States being the one to uphold an international order, we're not always going to be, the good guys, as you said with Cuba, with other wars all across, Latin America, the Middle East. We don't always make the right decisions. But we've said this point multiple times again. In the current times, with the UN as it is, we are the best ones equipped to take on this idea of international order. And as imperfect as we may be, we are still the best alternative. And so with that, this is where we kind of lead into where we're wanting to go with our next series, which is going to be called The Modern Empire. In this series, we're going to be looking at various different empires across history, some of them including Rome, the Catholic Church, with medieval Europe, the British Empire, and then getting into the very later stages of where we are now with what some people consider to be the American Empire. And so with modern empire, we're going to be looking at what makes an empire. Is it just military? Is it just economic? Or is it something ideological? Ideological. And so this is kind of where we've been leading towards at the end of at through these last few episodes of Peace Free Freedom. The United States, as we've just said, is is a country that is equipped to take upon this idea of international order. And so, what does that look like? Is it a good thing? How does it compare to the other empires? And this is kind of what we're going to be going forward. Khalil, you have something you want to add? We're trying to kind of finish this one up. So I'd like you could end us out because I know there's something you want to mention soon.
Right. So, as Chad and I are now in college, and it's been a few months now, we've been finding a lot of people that we've been wanting to, like add on as guest speakers, just to add more opinions, more point of views into the discussion. Not to just listen to people that agree with us to amplify our point, but to really, get other point of views out there to maybe strengthen our point because some of them may be stupid, you know, or to like really grapple with like academic discussion through debate. And so um that this is what we're calling the round table. We're bringing in professors as well as students our age, maybe a couple years younger, maybe a few years older, to speak about issues that we find interesting, philosophical, ethical, theoretical, political, if I didn't already mention historical, all different types of things, the analysis of all this. So get ready for it. And these are going to be a series of episodes that come out every few days, maybe once a week. It's hard to know what the schedule might be, but this is what you can expect until the Modern Empire, which first releases may come likely at once the new year comes, once like at the beginning of the new year. But until then, um, you'll be hearing mainly from me because Chad will be busy. And this is what will be the round table leading up to the Modern Empire. And this is the end of the episode, Begin the World Over Again, um, meaning a reform of the international system and the UN, United Nations, which is, as you might think, the world. United Nations. And so it's been fun here. This is the official end of the Peace v Freedom series, which technically ended a few episodes ago with Reform Don't Revolt, but officially now with this episode, Begin the World Over Again. I'm Khalil,
I'm Chad.
and we'll see you next time.